The cold from that marble wall didn't just seep into my bones. It went straight for my soul. Have you ever felt the air get sucked out of a room just by walking into it? Not because you're famous, and not because you're a threat, but simply because you exist in a way that someone else finds inconvenient. That was me. 3 hours ago, pinned against the freezing stone of Union Station, while the world I worked so hard to build crumbled under the weight of a single, suspicious stare. Before I get into the grit of how a morning that started with $1 billion merger ended with me tasting the copper of my own fear, I need to know, where are you watching this from? Are you sitting in your car? Are you at home? Drop a comment and let me know. I need to feel your presence today because, honestly, I'm still shaking a little just thinking about the look in that officer's eyes. It's a look that reminds you that no matter how many zeros are in your bank account, to some people, you're just a shadow in a suit. I've spent 20 years building a fortress. My life is measured in quarterly results, board meetings, and the precise cut of a Loro Piana blazer. This morning, when I woke up in my brownstone, the sun was hitting the mahogany floors just right. I felt invincible. I had my black bag, this vintage leather briefcase that's been with me since my first startup. It's more than a bag. It's a vault. It holds the signed contracts, the architectural blueprints for the new tech hub in Atlanta, and the physical prototypes that represent 3 years of sweat and tears. I stepped out into the crisp D.C. air, feeling like a king. The city was humming, that familiar American heartbeat of ambition and transit. I walked into the station, my heels clicking against the floor with the rhythm of a man who knows exactly where he's going. I was heading to a board meeting that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of my career. But there's a specific kind of silence that follows a black man in a high-end space. It's a quiet vibration, a frequency that most people don't even hear. I heard it the moment I stepped near the tracks. I saw him, Officer Miller. That's what the silver plate on his chest said, though his eyes said something else entirely. He was leaning against a pillar, his thumbs hooked into his utility belt, watching the crowd. Thousands of people were rushing past, a sea of beige trench coats and frantic commuters. But his eyes locked onto me. It wasn't a glance, it was a target acquisition. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, that internal GPS that tells you to straighten your tie, walk a little slower, and keep your hands visible. It's a survival instinct I thought I'd outrun 2 decades ago. I thought my success had bought me an exemption from that feeling. I was wrong. Success in this country is often just a bigger target on a more expensive suit. I tried to keep my focus. I checked my watch, a gift to myself after our IPO, and realized I had 10 minutes until my train. I shifted the weight of the black bag. It's heavy, solid. To me, that weight is the feeling of progress. To Officer Miller, apparently, it was the weight of a threat. I saw him push off the pillar. He didn't run. He didn't rush. He just started walking toward me with that slow, deliberate authority gait that makes your blood turn to ice. I told myself to stay calm. You're a CEO. I whispered to myself. You belong here. But the little boy from the South Side, the one who saw his father get pulled over for no reason every other Sunday, was screaming in the back of my head. I looked around, hoping someone else would notice the predatory way he was closing the gap. But everyone was looking at their phones, absorbed in their own lives, their own privilege. Sir, hold up a second, he barked. His voice had that jagged edge, like a serrated knife. I stopped. I didn't turn around too fast. I know the rules. You don't make sudden movements. You don't reach for your pockets. You become a statue. When I finally faced him, I put on my corporate face, the one that's calm, rational, and unthreatening. I tried to offer a polite, professional smile, but it felt like lead on my lips. He didn't smile back. He didn't even look me in the eye at first. He looked at the bag. He looked at my hands. He looked at the way my fingers were gripped around the leather handle. "Is there a problem, officer?" I asked. I kept my voice deep and steady, the way I do when I'm closing a deal. I wanted him to hear the education in my tone. I wanted him to hear the tax bracket I belonged to. But he wasn't listening to my voice. He was reading a script that had been written long before I was born. He asked me where I was going, what was in the bag, why I looked nervous. Nervous. I wasn't nervous until he started treating the marble floor like a crime scene. I told him I was a traveler, that I had a ticket, that I was heading to a meeting. I even offered to show him my ID. That was my mistake. When I reached toward my inner blazer pocket, the place where I keep my wallet, I saw his hand drop to his holster. It was a flash of movement, a blur of leather and steel. My heart didn't just beat. It slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. The world went silent. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the distant sound of a train whistle. Long and mournful. "Keep your hands where I can see 'em," he yelled. Now people were looking. Now the phones were coming out. I saw a young black boy, maybe 10 years old, standing with his mother near the newsstand. He looked at me, then at the officer, then back at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a terrifying realization. He was seeing his future in my present. He was seeing that the suit doesn't protect you. The leather bag doesn't protect you. Nothing protects you when the shadow falls. The officer stepped into my personal space. That aggressive, stifling heat of someone trying to break your will. He told me to turn around. He told me to put my hands against the wall. I felt the rough texture of the marble against my palms. It was so cold. I thought about my board members waiting for me. I thought about the blueprints in my bag, the dreams of hundreds of people who were counting on this deal. And here I was, being treated like a common thief in a station I'd walked through 1,000 times. I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. I could hear the whispers of the crowd. What did he do? Probably drugs. Look at that bag. He was probably stealing something. The assumptions were thick in the air. A poisonous fog that was harder to breathe than the city smog. "What's in the bag?" he asked again, his voice right in my ear. I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. I told him it was business documents. I told him I was the CEO of a major firm. He laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound that made me feel small. "Sure you are," he sneered. "And I'm the president." He kicked my feet further apart. I felt the fabric of my trousers strain. I felt my dignity being stripped away, layer by layer. Right there, in the middle of the morning rush, I looked down at the floor, at the polished stone, and I saw my own reflection. It was distorted, cracked by the light hitting the edges of the wall. I didn't recognize the man looking back at me. He looked hunted. He looked defeated. I tried to speak, to explain the importance of the meeting, to tell him that every second he held me here, he was jeopardizing a project that would bring jobs to his own community. But the words got stuck in my throat. How do you explain the value of a dream to someone who only sees you as a nightmare? I felt his hand reach for the black bag, which was sitting on the floor by my feet. He didn't pick it up carefully. He kicked it. The sound of the heavy leather hitting the floor echoed through the terminal. My heart stopped. That bag contained everything. It contained the only physical prototype of our new tech, a piece of hardware that had cost millions to develop and was fragile enough to break with a hard impact. I made a move to reach for it. An instinctive, protective reflex. "Don't touch that," I cried out. It wasn't an act of defiance. It was an act of desperation. But to Officer Miller, it was a threat. He grabbed my arm, twisting it behind my back with a force that made me gasp. The pain was sharp, white-hot, radiating from my shoulder down to my fingertips. He shoved me harder against the wall, my face pressed so close to the marble I could see the tiny veins in the stone. I could feel the eyes of the boy near the newsstand still on me. I wanted to tell him to look away. I wanted to tell him this wasn't how it was supposed to be. But I couldn't say anything. I was just a body now. A suspect. A problem to be solved. The officer called for backup on his radio. The crackle of the voice on the other end felt like a death knell. I realized then that I wasn't going to make my meeting. I wasn't going to be the hero of the day. I was going to be another statistic, another story whispered about in barbershops and dinner tables. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of the station. The grease, the cold air, the smell of thousands of people moving toward a future I was currently being barred from. I felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click around my right wrist, the teeth of the gear biting into my skin, marking me as something less than a citizen. Just as the second cuff was about to snap shut, a shadow fell over us. Not the shadow of another officer, but something else. I turned my head as much as I could, my cheek scraping against the stone. I saw a man in a dark overcoat, holding a camera, but he wasn't just filming. He was standing too close. He was looking at the bag. He was looking at the officer. And for the first time since this nightmare started, Officer Miller looked uncertain. He looked at the camera, then back at me, his grip on my twisted arm tightening until I thought the bone would snap. The crowd had gone completely silent now. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of my own heart, a drumbeat of pure, unadulterated terror as the officer reached down and grabbed the handle of the black bag, hoisting it up like a trophy of war. He began to unbuckle the brass latches, his fingers fumbling with the leather, his eyes fixed on the contents that he was convinced would justify everything he had just done to me. The metallic snap of those brass latches echoed against the marble floor like a pair of gunshots. Sharp and final, I watched, breathless, as Officer Miller's thick, calloused fingers pried open the leather maw of my life's work. He expected to find something jagged, something illicit, something that would turn his hollow suspicion into a solid victory. Instead, the contents spilled out under the harsh fluorescent lights of the terminal. Bundles of architectural renderings, velvet-lined cases holding glass and silicon prototypes, and a stack of notarized contracts that represented 3 decades of my blood, sweat, and absolute refusal to fail. For a heartbeat, there was a vacuum of sound. The crowd leaned in, their phones still hovering like digital vultures, waiting for a carcass that wasn't there. Miller's face didn't soften into an apology. It hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated frustration. He didn't see a businessman's portfolio. He saw his own mistake. And in his world, a mistake was a weakness he couldn't afford to admit. He rifled through the blueprints with a reckless disregard, his thumb leaving a smudge of grime on a design I had spent 6 months perfecting. Each crinkle of the paper felt like a slap. I stood there, one wrist still half encased in steel, my shoulder screaming from the torque he'd put on it, and I realized that my success was entirely invisible to him. He wasn't reading the names of the venture capital firms or the seals of the city planners. He was looking for a reason to keep me on my knees. When he finally realized the bag held nothing but the future of 100 employees and a multi-million-dollar tech hub, he didn't hand it back. He dropped it. The prototypes inside, the nexus cores we'd spent 4 years developing, clattered against the stone. I felt that sound in the pit of my stomach, a sickening thud that signaled the potential death of a dream before it even had its day. "You're lucky today," Miller muttered, his voice a low, gravelly threat as he finally uncuffed me. He didn't offer a hand up. He didn't acknowledge the red welts blooming on my wrists, or the fact that he'd just humiliated a man in front of hundreds. He just stood over me, adjusting his belt, waiting for me to scurry away like a beaten dog. But as I pushed myself up off that cold marble, my joints popping and my pride stinging worse than the physical pain, I caught the eye of that young boy again. He was still standing by the newsstand, his mother's hand tight on his shoulder. His expression had shifted from terror to a haunting kind of hollow understanding. He had just witnessed the black tax being collected in real time. He'd seen that a tailored suit and a corner office don't change the color of the shadow you cast. I wanted to go to him. I wanted to tell him that it gets better. But as I looked down at my scuffed shoes and my disheveled appearance, I realized I'd be lying. I knelt to gather my papers, my fingers trembling as I smoothed out the wrinkled blueprints. This bag, it wasn't just a bag. It was the legacy of a man named Elias, my father, who spent 40 years driving a bus in Chicago so I could sit in rooms he wasn't allowed to enter. I remember him coming home with grease under his fingernails and a quiet, heavy dignity in his eyes. He used to sit me down every Sunday and give me the talk, not the one about birds and bees, but the one about mirrors and shadows. "Son," he'd say, his voice like worn velvet, "the world is going to look at you and see a question mark. You have to be the exclamation point. You have to work twice as hard to get half as far, and you have to do it without ever letting them see you sweat." I had followed that rule religiously. I had become the exclamation point. I had built an empire, and yet, here I was, picking up the pieces of my life off a train station floor, while a man with a badge and a chip on his shoulder watched me with bored contempt. The humiliation started to ferment into something else, a cold, calculated fury, but I couldn't let it out. Not here, not now. I had a flight to catch. I had a merger to close. If I missed this window, the last 3 years of my life would be for nothing. I checked my watch again. I had less than an hour to get to the airport. The train was gone. The board meeting was in 3 hours, and it was 500 miles away. I shoved the prototypes back into the bag, not caring if they were cracked or shattered. I just needed to move. I stood up, squared my shoulders, and fixed my tie with fingers that refused to stay still. I didn't look back at Miller. I didn't give him the satisfaction of another glance. I walked toward the exit, every step feeling like I was pulling my feet out of wet cement. The taxi ride to the airport was a blur of gray highway and the smell of cheap air freshener. I sat in the back, staring at my reflection in the window. My eyes looked older. There were lines of exhaustion I hadn't noticed that morning. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. I kept thinking about the what-ifs. What if I had reached for my wallet a second faster? What if Miller had been having a worse day? What if that camera hadn't been there? The fragility of my existence hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I'm a CEO, but in that station, I was just a target. I took a deep breath. Trying to center myself, I had to get my head in the game. I had a presentation to give. I had to convince a room full of skeptical investors that I was the right man to lead this industry. But how do you pitch a vision of the future when you're still reeling from a past that refuses to stay buried? I reached out to my assistant, Sarah, her voice a frantic buzz in my ear. "Where are you?" "The board is already calling." They heard there was an incident at the station. It's on social media. I cut her off. I couldn't deal with the PR nightmare yet. I told her I was on my way to the airport, that I'd make it, that the deal was still on. I hung up and leaned my head against the cool glass. The irony was suffocating. I was going to a meeting to discuss disruptive technology, while my own life had just been disrupted by a system as old as the dirt beneath the tracks. When I reached the airport, the adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by a bone-deep lethargy. I moved through the terminal like a man in a dream. Security was another hurdle. I saw the TSA agents looking at me, and I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I put my bag on the belt. I took off my shoes. I stood in the body scanner with my hands over my head, a posture that felt far too similar to the one I'd just been forced into at the station. I felt exposed. I felt like everyone could see the marks on my wrists through the fabric of my shirt. I was waiting for the random check, the pat-down, the secondary screening. When the agent waved me through without a word, I didn't feel relieved. I felt like I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. I made it to the gate just as they were calling for first-class boarding. I should have felt a sense of triumph. I was here. I was moving. But as I handed my boarding pass to the attendant, she didn't smile. She looked at my disheveled suit, the smudge of dirt on my sleeve, and the frantic energy I couldn't quite hide. She looked at the black bag, the one that was now scuffed and dented. She paused, her finger hovering over the scanner, and for a split second, I saw that same flicker of suspicion I'd seen in Miller's eyes. It's a micro-expression, a tiny hitch in the breath. But when you've lived your whole life under a microscope, you learn to read the smallest shifts in the lens. She scanned the pass, her eyes lingering on my face a second too long, and then gestured toward the jet bridge with a stiff, formal nod. Walking down that tunnel felt like entering a pressurized chamber. I found my seat 1A, the pinnacle of air travel. Leather, wood grain, and silence. I stowed the bag in the overhead bin, handling it like it was made of blown glass. I sat down and sank into the cushions. Letting out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since 6:00 a.m. A flight attendant approached me. She was young, blonde, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Can I get you something to drink?" "Sir, water, champagne." Her tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, a subtle questioning of my presence there. I asked for a water. I just needed to hydrate. I needed to wash the taste of the station out of my mouth. As the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, I looked around the cabin. There were only 4 other people in first class. A man in his 60s with a tech-branded fleece vest, a woman scrolling through a fashion magazine, and 2 men sitting across from each other in the last row of the section. They weren't dressed like businessmen. They were wearing casual clothes, jeans and tactical-looking jackets, but they sat with a specific kind of stillness. Their eyes weren't on their phones or the safety cards. They were scanning the cabin. They were watching the passengers, and they were definitely watching me. Air marshals. I'd flown enough to recognize the silhouette. Usually, their presence is a comfort. Today, it felt like a cage. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Trying to visualize my presentation, I needed to focus on the value proposition, the scalability, and the long-term synergy. But all I could see was the marble wall. I could feel the cold. I could hear Miller's laugh. I opened my eyes and looked out the window as the engines began to roar. The ground fell away, the city shrinking into a grid of tiny lights and toy cars. We were climbing into the clouds, leaving the station and the officer behind. But the weight in my chest didn't lighten. It felt heavier the higher we went. I looked across the aisle and caught one of the air marshals looking at me. He didn't look away. He didn't nod. He just stared, his face a blank slate of professional observation. I reached for my bag in the overhead, wanting to check the prototypes one more time. I needed to know if they were still functional, if the glass was cracked. The deal was dead. I stood up, my muscles stiff and aching. As I reached for the bin, I felt the plane bank sharply to the left. I stumbled slightly, my hand catching the edge of the compartment to steady myself. The sound of the latch opening was loud in the quiet cabin. I pulled the bag toward me, but as I did, I felt a hand on my shoulder. Not a gentle hand, a firm, authoritative grip that sent a jolt of pure electricity through my spine, pinning me in place against the edge of the seat, while the hum of the engines suddenly seemed to grow into a deafening, predatory roar. I froze, the bag half hanging out of the bin, my heart leaping into my throat as I realized the silence in the cabin had changed. It wasn't the silence of luxury anymore. It was the silence of an impending collision. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I could feel the heat of someone standing inches behind me, their breath hitting the back of my neck, and the sudden, sharp realization that the nightmare hadn't ended at the station. It had simply changed altitude. And now, at 30,000 feet, there was nowhere left for me to run. The flight attendant was standing in the galley, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes darting between me and the man whose grip was tightening on my arm. And I knew in that moment that whatever peace I thought I'd found in the clouds was an illusion that was about to be shattered. The pressure on my blazer wasn't just a hand. It was a physical manifestation of every boundary I'd ever been told I wasn't allowed to cross. It was heavy, unyielding, and carried the unmistakable weight of someone who believed they had the moral high ground. I didn't turn around immediately. I couldn't. My lungs felt like they had been filled with the same thin, pressurized air circulating through the Boeing 787. I just stared at the overhead bin, at the scuffed leather of my bag that was now half dangling over the edge of the compartment. The silence in the first-class cabin was no longer the comfortable, expensive kind you pay $5,000 for. It was the sharp, jagged silence of an audience watching a car crash in slow motion. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back from the bin and keep your hands where I can see them," a voice said. It wasn't the flight attendant. It was deeper, gravelly, and carried the practiced calm of someone used to giving orders in high-stakes environments. I slowly let go of the bag. It sat there, precariously balanced, representing everything I had worked for. I turned around, my movements stiff, my joints still aching from the marble floor at Union Station. Standing there was one of the men I'd noticed earlier, the one in the tactical jacket. Up close, his eyes were like flint. He wasn't looking at my face, he was looking at my waistband, my pockets, and the red, raw circles around my wrists that my sleeves hadn't quite managed to hide. Behind him, the young flight attendant stood paralyzed, her hands gripping a tray of crystal glassware so hard her knuckles were turning white. I was just checking my belongings. I said. My voice sounded foreign to me, hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I tried to summon the CEO, the man who commands boardrooms, the man who speaks at tech summits in front of thousands. But that man was still back at the station, pinned against a wall. The man standing in the aisle of this plane was just a body under scrutiny. We had a report of erratic behavior, the air marshal said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. And that bag looks like it's been through a struggle. You were seen sweating, looking around, and now you're reaching for a compartment during a period of turbulence. We need to see what's in there. Now, I looked past him. The man in the tech fleece, the one who probably lived in a world where erratic behavior was just a sign of a creative genius, was staring at me with a mixture of pity and fear. He didn't say a word. He didn't stand up and say, "Hey, I saw this guy get harassed at the station." He just looked back down at his tablet, retreating into his privilege like it was a fortress. "It's tech," I whispered. "Prototypes. I'm a CEO. I have a meeting in 3 hours." The air marshal didn't blink. "I don't care if you're the King of England. Step into the galley. Move." Walking to the small, cramped space of the galley felt like walking to a gallows. The flight attendant moved out of the way, her eyes avoiding mine as if my misfortune was contagious. I felt the eyes of the other passengers on my back, hot, judging, and filled with a terrifying certainty. They didn't know me. They didn't know that I had spent my entire life being the good one, the one who worked the hardest, the one who never raised his voice. To them, I was just a disruption to their flight, a potential danger that needed to be neutralized. In the galley, the second air marshal joined us. He was younger, with a buzz cut and a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite. He reached up and pulled my black bag from the bin, bringing it into the galley and setting it on the stainless steel counter where they usually prepare the meals. "Open it." The first one ordered. My hands were shaking. I hate that they were shaking. It felt like a betrayal of my father's memory. He always told me to never let them see you tremble, because once they see the cracks, they'll pour the cement in. But I couldn't help it. The trauma of the morning was compounding, layer upon layer, until my nervous system was screaming. I reached for the latches. The brass was cold, just like the station floor. When the bag fell open, the interior light of the galley hit the prototypes. The Nexus cores were beautiful in a way only an engineer could truly appreciate. They were spheres of matte black carbon fiber, crisscrossed with delicate veins of glowing blue fiber optics. They looked like something out of a science fiction movie. To me, they were the culmination of 5 years of research into decentralized energy. To these men, who knew nothing of my world, they looked like components of a bomb. The younger marshal hissed through his teeth and stepped back, his hand flying to the holster concealed beneath his jacket. "What the hell is that?" "It's a solid-state energy core," I said, my voice rising in a desperate attempt to be heard. "It's not active. It's a prototype for a clean energy grid. Please, look at the documents. Look at the patents." I scrambled to pull the papers from the side pocket, but my haste only made it worse. A stack of architectural renderings for the Atlanta Tech Hub spilled onto the floor. I reached down to grab them, and the first marshal grabbed me by the back of my neck, shoving my head down toward the counter. "Don't move. Keep your hands flat," he barked. I was pinned again. My cheek was pressed against the cold steel of the galley counter. I could smell the faint scent of coffee and lemon disinfectant. Above me, the light was humming. Outside the small porthole window, there was nothing but an endless, indifferent blue sky. I was at 30,000 feet. And I've never felt more grounded in my life, grounded in the reality that my freedom was a fragile, conditional thing. "Is this yours?" the marshal asked, pointing at the glowing core. "It's my life." I choked out. The tears I had held back at Union Station finally broke. They didn't come with a sob, they just leaked out, hot and silent, dripping onto the stainless steel. I was a 50-year-old man, a man who had built a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And I was crying in the galley of a plane because I didn't know how to prove I was human. I thought about my father. I thought about the time he took me to his bus depot when I was 6. He showed me the engine, the grease, The way every part had to work in harmony for the bus to move. "Elias," he told me, "the world is going to try to tell you that you're just a part of the machine. But you're the driver. Don't ever let them take the wheel." But they had taken the wheel. They had taken the wheel. The bus and the road itself. The air marshals began a frantic, hushed conversation over their radios. I could hear snippets of it. Suspicious device. Passenger detained. Union Station incident confirmed. They were talking about me as if I wasn't there. I was a subject. I was a threat level. I stayed there, my face against the steel, listening to the hum of the engines and the sound of my own shallow breathing. I felt a strange, detached kind of peace in that moment. It was the peace of someone who had lost everything and realized they were still standing. The fear hadn't killed me. The humiliation hadn't erased me. "Get him up," the first marshal said. They pulled me to my feet. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, not caring about the optics anymore. My suit was ruined. My tie was askew. My dignity was a pile of ash on the floor. But I looked the first marshal in the eye. I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I saw the flicker of something in his expression. Not guilt, exactly, but a moment of hesitation. He looked at the prototypes again, then at the blueprints on the floor, and then at the raw, red marks on my wrists. "We're going to stay right here until we land," he said, his voice slightly less jagged than before. "No one goes back to their seat. You sit on that jump seat. Don't move." I sat on the small, uncomfortable fold-down seat used by the crew. The air marshals stood over me like sentinels. The flight attendant stayed in the back of the cabin, her face a mask of professional neutrality that hid a deep, vibrating anxiety. I stared at my bag. It was still open, its contents exposed like a wound. One of the fiber optic veins in the nexus core was flickering, a sign of a loose connection from when Miller had kicked it at the station. It looked like a dying heartbeat. I spent the next hour in that galley, suspended between heaven and earth, caught in a limbo of my own skin. I didn't try to explain anymore. I didn't try to pitch. I just sat. I watched the shadows of the clouds move across the metal floor. I thought about the board meeting I was going to. I thought about the investors, men who looked like the man in the tech fleece. I wondered if they would see the CEO when I walked in, or if they would see the man who had been detained twice in 6 hours. The emotional arc of the day was reaching its peak. I felt a shift within myself. I had spent my entire career trying to be the perfect example. I had tried to be so successful, so polished, and so undeniable that the world would have no choice but to respect me. I realized now that it was a lie. You can't out-earn prejudice. You can't outwork a system that was built to see you as a shadow. But you can survive it, and you can tell the story. The captain's voice came over the intercom, sounding jarringly normal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our initial descent into the airport. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." The air marshal looked at me. "When we land, there will be authorities waiting at the gate to verify your credentials and the safety of that equipment. If everything checks out, you're free to go. If not..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I nodded. I reached down and slowly, carefully, began to pack my bag. I picked up the blueprints. I smoothed out the wrinkles in the renderings. I tucked the flickering nexus core back into its velvet-lined nest. I did it with a deliberate, slow grace. It was the only power I had left, the power to treat my work with the respect it deserved, even if no one else would. As the plane banked again, the sun hit the galley at a sharp angle, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. I felt the pressure in my ears change as we dropped lower and lower, leaving the thin, cold air of the stratosphere for the heavy, humid reality of the ground. My heart was still racing, but the terror had been replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I looked at the flight attendant. She was buckled into her own seat across from me, her eyes fixed on the exit door. "I'm not a bad man," I said. It was the simplest thing I could think to say. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't an explanation. It was just a fact. She didn't answer. She just tightened her grip on the armrests as the wheels of the plane locked into place with a heavy, mechanical thud. I felt the descent in my gut, that sinking feeling that comes right before the impact. I clutched the handle of my black bag, the leather now damp from the sweat of my palms. I could see the ground coming up to meet us, the gray asphalt of the runway, the shimmering heat of the tarmac, and the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles already lined up near the terminal. I took a long, deep breath and closed my eyes, bracing myself for the jolt of the landing. I wasn't thinking about the merger anymore. I wasn't thinking about the money. I was thinking about how I was going to walk out of that door. I was thinking about the first word I was going to say when I finally got to speak for myself. Without a hand on my shoulder or a wall at my back, I felt the plane flare, the engine screaming in reverse, and the sudden, violent deceleration that pushed me forward against the harness, my fingers tightening around the black bag until I could feel the shape of the prototype inside, pulsing like a secret heart against the palm of my hand. The screech of the tires against the asphalt felt like a scream I had been holding in my own throat for hours. As the plane bucked and settled, the violent shudder of the airframe rattled the Nexus core inside my bag. But I didn't reach out to steady it. I just sat there, my spine pressed against the jump seat, watching the blue and red strobe lights of the airport police cruisers dancing against the plastic molding of the galley. We were on the ground. But I wasn't home. I wasn't safe. I was just in a different circle of the same hell. The air marshal kept his hand near his waist, his eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the bridge to connect, waiting to hand me over like a piece of hazardous cargo. When the door finally hissed open, the humid air of the city rushed in, thick and heavy, smelling of jet fuel and exhaust. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. 2 local officers were standing at the threshold, their faces unreadable, their thumbs hooked into their vests. They didn't see the CEO. They didn't see the innovator. They saw the subject that had been called in from 30,000 feet. I walked out of that plane with my head held high, clutching that scuffed black bag like a shield, while the passengers in first class watched me go with a silence that felt like a burial. The next hour was a blur of fluorescent lights and sterile interrogation rooms. They took the bag. They took my prototypes. I sat in a plastic chair, staring at a clock on the wall that seemed to be ticking in reverse. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just gave them the names of my lawyers, the patent numbers, and the contact information for the board of directors I was supposed to be meeting. I watched through a glass partition as a technician in a bomb suit poked and prodded at the work of my life. It was a slow-motion execution of my dignity. But then, something shifted. One of the officers walked in, looking at a tablet, then back at me. He looked uncomfortable. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on the wrong side of history. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice dropping the authoritative edge. "We've verified your credentials. And we've seen the video." He turned the tablet toward me. There it was. Union Station. Officer Miller's face was clear, his sneer caught in high definition. The video showed me against the wall. It showed the moment he kicked the bag. It showed the young boy watching with those hollow eyes. It had gone viral while I was in the air. 6 million views. 100,000 shares. The world had seen the shadow I'd been living in all morning. They didn't apologize, not really. But they gave me my bag back. They walked me to the curb, and as I stood there in the humidity, my suit ruined and my spirit frayed, I realized I had 20 minutes to get to the most important meeting of my career. I didn't call an Uber. I flagged a yellow cab, the same way my father used to when he wanted to feel like he owned the city for a few blocks. I sat in the back, opening the bag to look at the Nexus core. The blue light was still flickering, a dying ember of a dream. I pulled out a small screwdriver I keep in the lining in. With trembling fingers, I tightened the connection. The blue light flared to life, steady and strong, illuminating the dark interior of the cab. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I looked like a man who had survived a war. My tie was gone. My shirt was wrinkled, and there was a smudge of marble dust on my cheek. I didn't wipe it off. It was my war paint. When we pulled up to the glass and steel monolith that housed the investment firm, the doorman hesitated. He looked at my disheveled appearance, and I saw that familiar question mark in his eyes. I didn't wait for him to ask. I walked past him with the authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. I took the elevator to the 50th floor, the silence of the rising car a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. When the doors opened, the reception area was pristine, white marble, different from the station, but just as cold. "I'm Elias Vance," I told the woman at the desk. "I'm late for the future." She didn't look at my suit. She looked at my eyes. She stood up and led me toward the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom. I could hear the murmur of voices inside, the low, confident rumble of men who have never had to put their hands against a wall. I took a breath, felt the weight of the bag in my hand, and pushed the doors open. The room went silent. 7 men sat around a table that cost more than my first house. At the head of the table sat Arthur Sterling, the man who held the keys to the kingdom. He was older, with silver hair and eyes that looked like they had seen everything. He wasn't looking at the blueprints on the table. He was looking at his phone. In fact, they all were. The video of me at the station was playing on a loop on the giant monitor at the end of the room. "Mr. Vance," Sterling said, his voice a dry rasp. "We weren't sure you'd make it, given the circumstances." I walked to the table and set the black bag down in the center. I didn't apologize for being late. I didn't explain the wrinkles in my shirt. I just looked at him. "The circumstances are exactly why I'm here." "Arthur." I saw a man sitting to Sterling's left flinch. He looked remarkably like Officer Miller. The same jawline, the same set of the eyes. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I looked at the nameplate in front of him. Jonathan Miller, junior partner. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The officer at the station wasn't just a random cop. He was the son of the system I was trying to break into. The shadow wasn't just on the street, it was in the room. Sterling noticed the direction of my gaze. He looked at Jonathan, then back at me. He didn't say it, but the silence spoke volumes. He knew. He had seen his partner's son humiliate the man he was supposed to be in business with. He knew the video was a liability, but I didn't give him the chance to manage the PR. I didn't open the bag to show the blueprints. I didn't talk about scalability or decentralized energy. I walked to the monitor and paused the video of myself pinned against that marble wall. "This is my pitch," I said, my voice resonating in the quiet room. "You want to invest in disruptive technology? You want to talk about shattering paradigms? This is the reality of the man who built that core. I didn't build it in a lab with $1 million grant. I built it while navigating a world that wanted me on my knees. I built it while carrying a weight that none of you can imagine." I looked directly at Jonathan Miller. He turned away, unable to meet my eyes. My technology will change the world, I continued. But it won't matter if the world stays the same for the people who use it. If you want to invest in advanced tech, you're not just buying a battery. You're buying the resilience that made it possible. You're buying the fact that I walked out of a jail cell an hour ago and came here to tell you that I don't need your money as much as you need my vision. Because my vision is the only thing in this room that isn't afraid of the truth. The silence stretched out, long and thin, until I thought it might snap. I felt a strange sense of empowerment. I had spent my life playing the game, following the rules, trying to be the perfect version of myself, but the perfect version had been crushed against a wall. The man standing here now was something else. He was real. He was raw, and he was undeniable. Sterling stood up. He walked over to the table and looked at the black bag. He reached out and touched the scuffed leather. My son. He's a complicated man. Elias, he whispered, his voice so low the others couldn't hear. He's not complicated. Arthur, I said. He's a mirror. And right now, the reflection is ugly. I didn't wait for a handshake. I didn't wait for a contract. I picked up my bag and walked out of that boardroom. I felt lighter than I had in years. I had spoken my truth in the temple of the people who thought they owned it. I walked back to the elevator, the blue light of the Nexus core glowing through the cracks in the leather, a steady heartbeat of hope in the dark. I made it back to the street, the sun finally setting over the city skyline, painting the glass buildings in shades of bruised purple and gold. I stood on the sidewalk and took out my phone. I saw the comments on the video. Thousands of people sharing their own stories. Thousands of people saying they had felt that same cold marble against their palms. I realized then that my story time wasn't just about me. It was a bridge. It was a way for us to see each other in the shadows. Success isn't the title on my door. It's not the zeros in my bank account. It's the fact that I can look at that young boy from the station and tell him, with a straight face, that the shadow doesn't win. It's the fact that I can tell you this story, right now, and know that I'm not alone. If this story touched you, if you've ever felt like the world was trying to keep you in the dark, please hit that subscribe button. It helps me know that the message is getting through. And do me a favor, drop a comment below. Tell me about a time you had to choose between your dignity and your safety. I want to hear your stories. I want to know how you found your light. Because the only way we change the world is by refusing to stop talking about the one we're living in. I'm Elias Vance, and I'm still standing. Are you? Let me know in the comments. And I'll see you in the next video. Be safe out there. Sir, step away from the first-class line. Step away right now. That voice. It wasn't just loud. It was that specific kind of cold. Clinical tone that sounds like a steel door slamming shut. It's a sound that makes your blood turn into slush. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you know exactly what's about to happen. You know the script. You've seen it on the news. You've heard it in the stories your grandfather told you on the porch. And you felt it in the back of your neck every time a squad car trailed you for 2 blocks too long. But today was supposed to be different. I was wearing a $3,000 charcoal suit. I had a briefcase in my hand that held the future of 500 employees. I was the CEO. I was the success story. But in that moment, under the fluorescent hum of the terminal lights, none of that existed. I was just a target. Before I get into the grit of how this day nearly dismantled my entire life, and trust me, it gets darker than you can imagine, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever felt like a thief in a house you actually paid for? Have you ever walked into a room you earned your way into? only to realize everyone else thinks you're there to clean the floors or snatch a purse. I need to know if I'm alone in this. Drop a comment right now. Let me know where you're watching from, and tell me if you've ever had that out of place, feeling even when you're exactly where you belong. I'm reading every single one of these, because I need to know who's riding with me today. This isn't just a story. It's a weight I've been carrying, and I need to set it down. Let me take you back to how it started. It was 6:00 a.m. The air at the station was thick with the smell of burnt coffee and that metallic, electric tang you only get near train tracks and airport terminals. I was on my way to a billion-dollar merger meeting in D.C. This was the big one. The kind of deal that shifts the geography of an entire industry. My company, a tech logistics firm. I started in a garage with nothing but a credit card and a prayer. Was finally crossing the finish line. I felt like I was walking on air. I remember checking my reflection in the glass of a closed Hudson newsstand. I looked good. My tie was perfectly knotted. My shoes had a mirror shine. And for the first time in my 52 years, I felt like the world was finally playing fair. I walked toward the priority boarding lane. I've reached that level where I don't have to wait in the long, winding snakes of people. I've paid my dues. I've got the miles, the status, the gold, or platinum, or whatever color they use to tell you that you're a valued human being. But as I stood there, adjusting my cufflinks, I felt a shift in the atmosphere. You know that feeling when the temperature drops 5 degrees for no reason. That's what it felt like when the man behind me, a middle-aged guy in khakis and a polo shirt, looking like he just stepped off a golf course, started huffing. He wasn't just breathing, he was making noise. That impatient, entitled sound people make when they think someone is in their way. I ignored it. I've learned to tune out the background noise of prejudice. But then, he spoke, not to me, but near me. "Excuse me," he said, his voice dripping with that fake politeness that hides a razor blade. "This is the first class and priority line. The general boarding is back there, near the end of the terminal." I turned slowly, giving him my best boardroom smile, the one I use to close deals. "I know," I said, my voice smooth and steady. "That's why I'm standing here." He didn't smile back. He looked at my suit. Then he looked at my skin. Then he looked at my Toomey briefcase. His eyes narrowed. He didn't see a CEO. He saw a mistake. He saw someone who must have taken a wrong turn on the way to the loading dock. He looked past me toward the gate agent, a young woman who had been busy typing on her computer. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, finally looking up. She didn't look at my boarding pass first. She looked at the man in the polo shirt. He gave her a look, a shared, silent understanding that I wasn't supposed to be part of this picture. "I think this gentleman is in the wrong place," the man said, gesturing toward me like I was a piece of luggage that had fallen off a cart. The gate agent turned her eyes to me. The warmth that usually greets a high-status traveler was gone. It was replaced by a clinical, suspicious gaze. "Sir, can I see your identification and your boarding pass?" "Of course," I said. I reached into my pocket. My heart started to do that slow, heavy thud. Thump, thump, thump. I pulled out my phone with the digital pass and my passport. I handed them over, keeping my hands visible, keeping my movements slow. I've been taught since I was 6 years old that a black man's movements must be choreographed like a ballet if he wants to stay safe. She took my passport. She looked at it. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at the computer. She spent a long time looking at that screen. Too long. "Is there an issue?" I asked. I could feel the eyes of the other passengers now. The line was growing. People were whispering. I could hear the word suspicious floating in the air like a poisonous gas. That's when I saw them. 2 officers, white shirts, dark pants, heavy belts laden with gear that clinked with every step. They weren't walking, they were advancing. They weren't coming to help. They were coming for me. The man in the polo shirt smirked and stepped back, giving them room to work. He looked satisfied, like he'd just called in a successful tip to a crime hotline. "Sir, step away from the line," the first officer said. This was the voice I told you about. The steel door. "Officer, I'm just trying to board my flight to DC," I said. I tried to keep my CEO voice, authoritative, calm, logical, but my voice sounded thin in my own ears. "I have a very important meeting. My credentials are right there with the agent." The officer didn't even look at the agent. He looked at my briefcase. "What's in the bag?" "Sir, documents, a laptop, personal items," I replied. "I'm the CEO of a logistics firm. I'm happy to show you, but I'd prefer to do it somewhere less public. We'll decide where we do it," the second officer said. He moved to my right, flanking me. It's a tactical move. They were boxing me in. I looked around the terminal. This place that was supposed to be a gateway to my greatest success had become a cage. The priority I had paid for was a lie. The suit I was wearing felt like a costume that had failed to protect me. I looked at the gate agent, hoping for a shred of human connection, a sign that she realized how ridiculous this was. But she just looked down at her keyboard, avoiding my eyes. She had already decided I was a problem to be solved, not a customer to be served. "We need you to come with us for a secondary screening," the first officer said. He didn't ask. He reached out and grabbed my upper arm. It wasn't a hard grip, but it was firm. It was the grip of ownership. A secondary screening. We all know what that means. It's the polite term for, "We're going to take you to a windowless room and remind you who's really in charge." I felt a surge of heat in my chest, a mix of pure, unadulterated rage and a soul-crushing sadness. I wasn't a father, a husband, or a leader of men. I was a suspicious male in an expensive suit that didn't fit the narrative they had written for me. "I have a billion-dollar merger happening in 4 hours," I said, my voice trembling slightly now. "If I miss this flight, the deal falls apart. People lose their jobs. Please, just look at my ID. Sir, if you continue to be uncooperative, we will have to escort you out of the terminal in restraints," the officer said. He leaned in closer. I could smell the peppermint on his breath and the faint scent of gun oil. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." They began to lead me away, not toward the gate, but away from it, back toward the shadows of the terminal, toward the service corridors, where the important people don't go. I felt the eyes of everyone in that line, the judgment, the pity, the "I knew it" looks. I felt smaller than I've ever felt in my life. I looked down at my polished shoes, now scuffed from the officer's boot as he bumped into me, and I realized that the American dream I thought I had captured was nothing more than a ghost. As we walked, the sound of the terminal, the announcements, the rolling suitcases, the chatter started to fade, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic thud of the officer's boots on the linoleum. We reached a heavy gray door with no window. One of the officers swiped a badge, and the lock clicked with a sound that felt like it was vibrating in my very marrow. He pushed the door open and gestured for me to enter. It was a small room, maybe 10 by 10. A single metal table, 2 chairs, and a camera in the corner that looked like a cold, unblinking eye. There was no window. There was no clock. There was just the hum of an air vent and the suffocating realization that the world I had built for myself had vanished the moment that door swung shut. "Sit down," the officer commanded. I didn't sit at first. I stood there, clutching my briefcase to my chest like a shield, my knuckles turning white against the leather. My breath was coming in shallow, jagged bursts, and the CEO mask I had spent decades perfecting was beginning to crack, revealing the raw, terrified boy I used to be, standing on a street corner in Atlanta, watching the blue and white lights flash in the distance. I looked at the metal chair, cold and unforgiving, and I could feel the invisible weight of 1,000 similar rooms pressing down on my shoulders, pinning me to the spot where my dignity used to be. The metal chair was even colder than it looked, a biting chill that seeped through the fine wool of my trousers and settled deep into my bones. I finally let go of the briefcase, placing it on the scarred surface of the table with a hand that I fought to keep from trembling. The sound it made, a dull, heavy thud, felt like the closing argument of a trial I hadn't been allowed to testify in. One officer stood by the door, his arms crossed, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark stain. The other sat across from me, pulling a pair of blue latex gloves onto his hands. The snap of the rubber against his wrists echoed in the small space. A sharp, clinical sound that made my skin crawl. It was the sound of being handled like an object, a piece of evidence, rather than a man who had spent 30 years building a legacy from the red dirt of Georgia to the glass towers of Manhattan. I looked at the camera in the corner. I wondered who was on the other side of that lens. Was it someone who saw a father, a taxpayer, or was it just another person waiting for me to act out so they could justify the steel on their hips? I took a breath, trying to find that center, that place of absolute stillness I use when I'm negotiating with venture capitalists who think they can lowball me. But here, the leverage wasn't money. It was my breath. It was my freedom. "Name?" the officer asked, not looking up from a clipboard. "Rowan. Rowan Vance," I said. I kept my voice low, resonant. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of hearing the vibration of fear. "CEO of Vance Global Logistics. You have my passport right there." He finally looked up, but his eyes didn't hold any recognition of my title. He looked at me with a weary, practiced skepticism, the kind you save for a habitual liar. And what brings a CEO to the station at 6 in the morning with a briefcase full of, what exactly is in here? Rowan. The way he used my first name was a deliberate jab. It was a way to strip away the mister, the sir, the executive. It was a way to remind me that in this room, the hierarchy of the outside world didn't exist. I told your partner. Contracts, secure servers blueprints, legal documents for a merger that is scheduled to happen in Washington, D.C. in less than 4 hours. If I am not on that flight, that deal dies. And if that deal dies, 500 families lose their livelihoods. I am happy to cooperate, but I need you to understand the stakes here. The stakes I care about are the safety of this terminal, he said, reaching for the latches on my briefcase. I watched his gloved fingers work the locks. That briefcase was more than just a bag to me. It was my portable sanctuary. He popped the latches. The sound was like a gunshot in the cramped room. He began to pull things out, laying them across the table with a careless disregard that made my chest tighten. My leather-bound planner, my noise-canceling headphones, and then the thick, gold-embossed folders containing the merger agreements. He flipped through the pages, his gloved thumb smudging the ink on signatures that had taken months to secure. Lots of big words in here, he muttered, almost to himself. He looked at a diagram of a regional distribution hub. What's this? Blueprints for a building. It's a schematic for a high-efficiency warehouse, I explained, leaning forward just an inch before I caught myself and sat back. It's proprietary technology. It's why the company I'm meeting with is willing to pay 9 figures for my firm. He didn't look impressed. He looked suspicious. Or it's a map of a secure facility. You see how this looks. Rowan, a guy dressed up like $1,000,000, acting nervous at the gate, carrying schematics for secure buildings. You fit a profile we've been briefed on. The profile, there it was, the ghost in the room. I felt that heart-wrenching pain, that Noi Jiao Zheilong my grandmother used to talk about when she described the way the world tries to break a black man's spirit before he even gets a chance to use it. It wasn't just about me. It was about every man who looked like me who had ever stood in a room like this, trying to prove that his ambition wasn't a crime. I wasn't acting nervous, I said, my voice hardening. I was acting like a man who was being harassed by a passenger who didn't think I belonged in first class. Systems fail. The officer by the door chimed in. He hadn't moved a muscle. And people change. Sometimes the most successful ones are the ones who think they're above the law. They think their suit is a shield. I looked at him, and for a second, the CEO disappeared. The man who handles boardrooms disappeared. I was just a human being looking at another human being, wondering how we got here. My suit isn't a shield, I said softly. It's a uniform, just like yours. I put it on every morning to show the world that I am a professional, that I am capable, that I am someone to be taken seriously. The fact that you see it as a disguise, that's not my failure. It's yours. The room went dead silent. The officer with the gloves stopped searching. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something that wasn't just bureaucratic coldness. Wait here, he said. He gathered up my passport and my phone. We need to verify these contracts with our digital forensics team. Make sure there's nothing hidden in the metadata of that laptop. You're taking my phone? I asked, my voice rising. I need to call my legal counsel. I need to notify my team in D.C. that I've been detained. You haven't been detained yet, he said, standing up. You're being screened. There's a difference. Sit tight. The door opened and closed, the lock clicking back into place with a finality that felt like a sentence. I was alone. I sat there, staring at the gray wall. The fluorescent light above me hummed, a low, persistent buzz that felt like it was drilling into my temples. I looked at the disarray on the table. My life, scattered like trash. I thought about the people waiting for me at the other end of that flight. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe. I thought about my father. He used to tell me, Rowan, they're going to try to take your dignity. They'll try to snatch it right out of your pocket like a common thief. But the secret is, they can only take it if you hand it to them. You keep your head up. You keep your words straight. And you never, ever give them the satisfaction of seeing you break. I opened my eyes. I wasn't going to break, but the frustration was a physical weight in my chest. I looked at my watch. 6:45 a.m. The flight was boarding. The final call would be happening in minutes. I stood up and started pacing the small room. 3 steps. Turn. 3 steps. Turn. Every time I passed the door, I felt an impulse to pound on it. But I knew that in this context, powerful is interpreted as threatening. Suddenly, the door clicked. The first officer walked back in. He just walked to the table and slid my passport and phone across the surface. You're clear, he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any apology. The forensics check came back clean. Your merger documents look legitimate. I didn't move. That's it. After 45 minutes in a windowless room, I'm just clear. You're free to go. Rowan, he said, already turning to leave. Try to be more cooperative at the gate next time. It saves everyone a lot of trouble. Cooperative. The word tasted like ash. I didn't waste time arguing. I grabbed my briefcase, shoving the folders inside with a frantic, desperate energy. I burst out of that gray room, stumbling slightly as I hit the brightly lit corridor of the main terminal. The transition was jarring. 1 second I was in a tomb of suspicion, and the next I was back in the world of commerce. I started to run. I'm 52, and running through a terminal in a bespoke suit while carrying a 15-pound briefcase is a different kind of exercise. My lungs started to burn. I wove through the crowds, shouting, "Excuse me," and coming through, with a voice that sounded foreign to my own ears, high-pitched and panicked. I saw the sign for Gate B12. It felt like a mirage. I checked my watch as I sprinted. 5 a.m. The door should be closed. I rounded the final corner, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The gate area was empty, but the gate agent, the same woman from before, was still there, reaching for the microphone to make a final announcement, or maybe just to close the flight out for good. Wait. I wheezed, my voice cracking. I reached the counter, slamming my briefcase down so hard the computer monitor rattled. I couldn't even speak. I just pointed at my chest. Then at the jet bridge door, she looked at me. There was no pity in her eyes, just a cold, professional annoyance. She looked at the clock, then back at me. I stood there, sweat dripping down my forehead, my expensive tie askew, my dignity in tatters, waiting for her to tell me I was too late. I was a man who had everything, yet in that moment, I was a beggar, praying for the grace of a woman who had already helped hand me over to the wolves. She sighed, a long, dramatic sound that seemed to pull the last bit of air out of my lungs. The silence of the empty gate area felt like it was crushing me, the only sound being the frantic, uneven rhythm of my own heart as I gripped the edge of the laminate counter. The scanner made a sharp, high-pitched chirp that sounded like a lifeline in the middle of a storm. She didn't say a word, but she stepped aside. The door to the jet bridge was still open. I didn't say thank you. I just grabbed my bag and moved. Walking down that jet bridge was like walking the plank, only in reverse. My legs felt like lead. By the time I reached the aircraft door, a flight attendant was standing there, her smile tight and professional, but her eyes were already scanning me, looking for the disruption she had clearly been warned about. Seat 1A, I managed to say. She nodded toward the first row. I stepped into the cabin. The air-conditioned chill of the first-class cabin hit me, but the silence, man, the silence was deafening. It was the sound of 20 people who had been watching the drama at the gate, now staring at the problem as he finally boarded. I sat down in 1A. I shoved my briefcase under the seat in front of me. I just wanted the wheels to leave the ground. The passenger in 1B, a woman in a crisp white blazer, shifted in her seat. I didn't have to open my eyes to know she was looking at me. Then, I heard the sound that every black man in America knows in the pit of his stomach. The sound of a purse being pulled closer. The zipper sliding shut with a definitive snap. I opened my eyes and looked straight ahead. My reflection in the small window was unrecognizable. My eyes were bloodshot. My skin looked gray, and my suit was wrinkled. I felt like an intruder in my own life. I had paid $5,000 for this seat, but the woman next to me was acting like I was a hitchhiker who had climbed in through the window. I wanted to turn to her and say, "I have a master's degree from Stanford. I employ 500 people. But I realized that none of that mattered. To her, I was just a suspicious male. The flight attendant started the safety briefing, but her voice was drowned out by the roar of the engine starting up. I felt a tiny spark of hope. We're moving, I thought. But then, the plane stopped. It wasn't a smooth stop. It was a jerk. The engines whined down to a low, ominous hum. I looked out the window. We were still at the gate. The jet bridge hadn't even pulled away yet. A moment later, the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped out. He didn't look at the passengers. He whispered with the flight attendant, their eyes darting toward row 1. My heart started that heavy, rhythmic thud again. Then, the cabin door swung open. 2 new officers stepped onto the plane. They were younger, bigger, and they were wearing tactical vests. They stopped at row 1. Mr. Vance. The first one said, "We need you to step off the aircraft." "Sir." I didn't move. I was just cleared, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The officer said, "We received a secondary report of suspicious behavior once you boarded. A passenger expressed concern, and we have to conduct a field interview on the jet bridge." I looked at the woman in 1B. She was staring straight ahead. Her jaw set. She was the concerned passenger. She had decided that my desperation was a danger to her. "I am a CEO," I said, and this time, my voice wasn't a whisper. "You are pulling me off this plane because a woman is uncomfortable sitting next to a black man in first class." "Sir, don't make a scene," the second officer said, his hand moving toward his belt. "Just grab your bag and step out." I looked around the cabin. I saw a young man in row 4 holding up his phone. The lens pointed directly at my face. I could see the little red dot of the recording light. I realized then that I was about to become that guy. The guy in the viral video. The humiliation was a physical thing. It felt like hot oil being poured over my head. I reached down and grabbed my briefcase. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely grip the handle. I stood up. As I passed the young man with the phone, I stopped. I didn't yell. I just looked directly into the camera lens. "Are you getting this?" I asked him softly. "Make sure you get the suit. Make sure you get the briefcase." The officer shoved me toward the door. "Keep moving." "Sir." I stepped back out onto the jet bridge. The door to the plane hissed shut behind me. I was standing in that accordion-like tunnel. 2 armed men in front of me. The polite officer turned to me. "Okay, Mr. Vance, we just need to ask a few questions about your behavior at the gate." But something inside me snapped. It wasn't a violent snap. It was a shift. It was the moment the victim died, and the CEO took over. I took a step forward. Closing the gap, I stood at my full height, 6'2" of refined, righteous anger. "No," I said, and this time, I used my boardroom voice. It's the voice that silenced billionaires. "We are not doing this. You are going to listen to me, and you are going to listen very carefully." The officers blinked. They weren't used to this. "My name is Rowan Vance," I said, my voice echoing in the jet bridge. "I have already been detained and searched. I have been cleared. You are currently interfering with a multi-million-dollar interstate commerce transaction. You are violating my civil rights based on the groundless concerns of a passenger who has no evidence of wrongdoing other than her own prejudice." "Sir, you need to calm down," the officer started. "I am perfectly calm," I interrupted. "I am so calm that I am thinking 3 steps ahead of you. I want the captain of that aircraft out here right now. I want the station manager out here right now. And I want your badge numbers. You're making this a much bigger deal than it needs to be." The big officer said, "It is a big deal." I roared. the sound bouncing off the metal walls. My life is a big deal. My time is a big deal. Now, get the captain. I'm not answering another question until the man responsible for that aircraft is standing in front of me. Inside, I was a wreck. I was terrified. But the other voice, the voice of my father, told me to stay. It told me that if I walked away now, I'd never be able to look at myself in the mirror again. I stood there, my chest heaving, my briefcase gripped in a white-knuckled fist, staring down the two men who represented everything that was trying to hold me back. I could feel the heat of the jet bridge and the weight of the silence from the plane, and I realized that my success wasn't a destination, it was a battleground. The aircraft door didn't just open, it groaned. A heavy, pressurized release that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the jet bridge. I stood my ground, refusing to give an inch. And then, he appeared. The captain. He was older than he looked, with deep-set eyes. He stepped out and into the dim, stagnant heat of the bridge. He didn't look at the officers first. He looked at me. He looked at my eyes. Then at the way I was holding my briefcase. "What seems to be the trouble out here?" he asked. The bigger officer spoke up quickly. "Captain, we had a report of suspicious behavior. We're just conducting a follow-up interview." The captain turned his gaze to the officers. A follow-up? This gentleman was already cleared by security at the gate. "Is that correct?" "Protocol." "Captain," the polite officer chimed in. The passenger's concern was specific to his behavior once he reached the seat. "Your responsibility is to the law," the captain interrupted. "My responsibility is to this aircraft, and I don't run a cabin based on the whims of a nervous flyer who doesn't like the look of the person sitting next to them." He turned back to me. "Mr. Vance. Rowan Vance." I nodded. "Vance Global Logistics," he said. "You're the man who donated that fleet of refrigerated trucks to the food bank in Chicago, aren't you? My brother works for one of your hubs. Says you're the only boss he's ever had who actually knows the names of the mechanics." The silence that followed was heavy. I felt the tension in my shoulders break. To be recognized as a man who had done good, it was almost more than I could handle. "I am," I said, "and I'm trying to get to a meeting that determines whether or not your brother still has a job next year." "Captain." The captain looked at the officers. "Gentlemen, if you have a warrant, you take him. But if you're just here to satisfy the prejudices of a woman, then you're finished, because this man is a passenger on my plane, and I'm not pushing back until he's back in his seat." The officers looked at each other. They knew they had lost. Without another word, they turned and walked back up the jet bridge. I stood there, my hand still white-knuckled around the handle of my briefcase. The captain reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance. It shouldn't be this way. Please, come back inside. I'd be honored to have you on board." I walked back through that door. I walked back into the cabin, and I can tell you, the air felt different. I walked down the aisle, past the rows of people who had watched me be hauled off like a criminal, and I kept my head high. When I reached row 1, I saw her, the woman in 1B. She was staring out the window, her body rigid. She didn't look at me as I sat down. The shame was radiating off her. I sat in 1A. I buckled my seatbelt, and I placed my briefcase right back where it belonged. I didn't say a word to her. My presence was the protest. As the plane finally pushed back, I looked at my reflection. The suit was still wrinkled, but the man looking back at me was someone I finally recognized. I thought about the merger, and suddenly, it all felt so small. What had happened today, the way I had to fight for the right to simply be, that was the real work. We took off into a gray morning. As we leveled out at 30,000 feet, I thought about why I'm telling this story. It's not because I want you to feel sorry for me. I'm a CEO. I'm doing fine. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that success isn't a shield. You can build the biggest company, but it won't change the way some people see you. It won't stop the storm, but it can give you a better umbrella. The American dream has a price tag, and for people who look like me, the price is often paid in dignity. But I'm here to tell you, don't stop walking. You belong in the room. You belong in the seat. You belong in the sky. When we landed in D.C., I walked off that plane and didn't look back. I did the deal. But the highlight of my day was calling my daughter. I told her I loved her, and then I told her, "Baby, no matter how high you fly, remember that your wings aren't made of the things you own. They're made of the truth of who you are. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you're in the wrong seat." So, I'm asking you now if this story hit home for you. Please, share this. Hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment. And let me know how you're finding your own way through the storm. We're in this together. And to the captain, wherever you are, thank you for seeing the man, not just the profile. I'm Rowan Vance, and this was my story. I'm going to take a moment now to just breathe and be grateful that I'm home. Stay safe out there. Stay strong. And never forget that you are exactly where you're supposed to be. I'll see you in the next one.